She signed away rights to money she never had, protecting a fortune he never knew existed, and in that moment, the real game began. She signed away rights to money she never had, protecting a fortune he never knew existed, and in that moment, the real game began. Victoria Ashworth stared at the prenuptial agreement spread across the mahogany desk, her manicured fingers trembling slightly as she held the Mont-Blanc pen. The law office smelled of leather and old money, fitting, considering the fortune that surrounded her life like a secret she'd buried so deep, sometimes she almost forgot it existed. Just sign it, Vicky. Richard's voice carried that edge she'd learned to recognize over their 2-year courtship, the tone that brooked no argument, that assumed compliance. It's really just a formality. You don't have any significant assets anyway. She looked up at him, this man she'd agreed to marry, studying the sharp angles of his jaw, the way his expensive suit fit perfectly across his shoulders. Richard Morrison embodied everything her world had taught her to value. Successful, handsome, from the right family. But sitting here, watching him drum his fingers impatiently on the desk while his lawyer shuffled papers, she felt something cold settle in her chest. Of course, she murmured, her voice barely audible. Just a formality. The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so crushing. The woman who owned 3 properties in Manhattan, a vineyard in Napa, and enough stock portfolios to fund a small country's budget, was signing away rights to assets worth approximately $3,000, her savings account and a 5-year-old Honda Civic. What do you think Victoria should do in this moment? Should she reveal the truth about her wealth, or continue the charade? Share your thoughts below. Richard's lawyer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat. Mrs. Ashworth-to-be, this agreement stipulates that in the event of divorce, you waive all claims to Mr. Morrison's business interests, properties, and accumulated wealth during the marriage. In return, you retain your personal assets as of today's date. Which amounts to what, exactly? Richard asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer would be inconsequential. Victoria felt heat rise in her cheeks. My savings. My car. Some jewelry. Grandmother's pearls, probably, Richard chuckled, and his lawyer joined in with a polite laugh. If only they knew about the Cartier collection locked away in a safety deposit box under her maiden name. Or the Van Cleef & Arpels pieces her grandmother had actually left her, the grandmother who'd built a pharmaceutical empire from nothing and left it all to the granddaughter who'd inherited her business acumen along with her eyes. She signed her name with a flourish that felt like signing away a piece of her soul. Not because of the money. Money had never meant freedom to her, only obligation and suspicion about others' motives. But because in this moment, she realized she'd been testing Richard all along, hoping desperately that he would love her without knowing about the Ashworth fortune. The test results were becoming clearer by the day. There. She set down the pen with a soft click. All done. Richard's smile was triumphant, the expression of a man who'd just secured a very good deal. He leaned over and kissed her cheek, a gesture that felt more like marking territory than affection. Smart girl. I knew you'd understand, this protects both of us. 20 blocks away, in a glass-walled conference room overlooking Central Park, another conversation was taking place. Miss Ashworth, the quarterly reports are ready for your review. James Hartford, her personal attorney and the only person who knew her true identity, slid a folder across the polished table. The pharmaceutical patents alone generated another $12 million this quarter. Victoria's assistant, Madison, looked up from her laptop. And the Meridian Foundation wants to know if you're ready to announce the scholarship program. The media packet is prepared for whenever you want to go public with your philanthropy. Victoria, or rather, the woman Richard knew as his financially dependent fiancée, loosened the simple scarf around her neck and transformed back into the person she really was. Her posture straightened, her voice gained authority, and the uncertain tremor disappeared entirely. Not yet. She flipped through the reports with practiced efficiency. I need more time. Victoria, James said carefully, forgive me for overstepping, but this charade with Morrison is getting complicated. What happens when you're married? How long can you maintain this double life? She looked out at the park, watching tiny figures move along the paths like pieces on a chessboard. Until I know for certain what kind of man I'm marrying. And if he fails the test? A smile played at the corners of her mouth, but it held no warmth. Then he'll discover that his prenup was the best thing that ever happened to him. Because when this is over, he'll realize exactly what he almost had, and what he threw away. James raised an eyebrow. And if he passes? For the first time that day, Victoria's expression softened. Then I'll tear up that prenup myself and show him what real partnership looks like. But as she gathered her things to return to the apartment she shared with Richard, the modest two-bedroom in the Upper West Side that he believed was the extent of her means, doubt crept in like fog. 3 weeks until the wedding, and every day brought new evidence that Richard Morrison was exactly the kind of man she'd spent her life avoiding. The kind who measured love in dollars and cents. The kind who would never see her for who she really was. The kind who was about to discover that sometimes the quiet mouse has the sharpest teeth. 3 weeks passed like a countdown to an execution Victoria wasn't sure she wanted to escape. The morning of their wedding dawned grey and drizzling, as if the universe itself was offering commentary on the proceedings. Victoria stood before the full-length mirror in the bridal suite of the Plaza Hotel, studying her reflection in the vintage Vera Wang gown, a dress that had cost more than Richard believed she made in 6 months, purchased with cash from an account he'd never known existed. "You look beautiful, sweetheart." Her mother, Catherine Ashworth, appeared in the reflection behind her, elegant in navy silk. Catherine was one of the few people who knew about Victoria's elaborate deception, and her face carried the weight of unspoken questions. "Do I look like a woman about to make the biggest mistake of her life?" Victoria's voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she adjusted her grandmother's pearl earrings, not the costume jewelry Richard assumed, but genuine Mikimoto pieces worth more than his car. Catherine's reflection met her daughter's eyes. "I look like a mother watching her brilliant daughter play a very dangerous game." "It's not a game anymore, Mom." Victoria turned away from the mirror. "It's a test. And I think he's failing." The morning had started badly. Richard had called at 6 a.m., not to wish his bride good morning or tell her he loved her, but to remind her about the seating arrangements. "Make sure your college friends aren't seated anywhere near the Morrison table," he'd instructed. "And that roommate of yours, Madison, she needs to tone down the designer handbag situation. People will start asking questions about where a graduate student gets Hermes money." If he only knew that Madison wasn't just her roommate but her personal assistant, and that the Hermes bag was actually a gift Victoria had bought her for Christmas, one of 12 identical bags she'd purchased for her staff. What would you do if someone you loved tried to hide your friends because they made them look bad? Is this a red flag, or just wedding day nerves? Let us know your thoughts. A soft knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Victoria? It's James." James Hartford entered carrying a manila envelope and wearing the expression of someone about to deliver either very good or very bad news. "I have something for you. Call it a wedding gift." He held out the envelope. The final report on Richard Morrison. Victoria stared at the envelope as if it contained a live snake. She'd hired investigators months ago, telling herself it was just due diligence. Rich people always investigated their potential spouses. It was practically required. But now, holding the results in her hands, she felt like she was about to open Pandora's box. "Just tell me," she whispered. "Is he who he says he is?" James's pause lasted a heartbeat too long. "He's exactly who he says he is. That's the problem." "What do you mean?" Richard Morrison, 34, graduated Harvard Business School, currently managing partner at Morrison & Associates investment firm. Everything checks out. But Victoria. James hesitated. "He's not marrying you for love." The words hit like a physical blow, even though she'd suspected them for weeks. The investigation shows he's been strategically courting women from wealthy families for the past 5 years. He targets women who appear to have family money but limited personal assets. The prenup isn't about protecting his wealth, it's about positioning himself to access family wealth through marriage while minimizing his legal exposure. Victoria sank into the velvet chair by the window, the weight of her wedding dress suddenly feeling like chains. "He thinks I'm from old money," she said numbly. "The Ashworth name, the way I carry myself, my education. He assumes there's a trust fund somewhere." "Exactly. He's counting on family connections and future inheritance. He has no idea that you already control the entire Ashworth fortune, and that by making you sign that prenup, he's actually protecting your assets from him." Catherine moved to her daughter's side, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Sweetheart, it's not too late to." "No." Victoria stood abruptly, surprising both of them with the steel in her voice. "I'm going through with this." "Victoria. He wants to marry me for money I don't appear to have, hoping to gain access to money he thinks my family has. The irony is too perfect." A smile spread across her face, but it held no warmth. He's about to marry one of the richest women in America, and he'll never know it. That's not a foundation for a marriage, dear, Catherine said softly. No, Victoria agreed, but it might be the foundation for the most educational experience of Richard Morrison's life. She moved to the window, looking down at Fifth Avenue where early afternoon traffic crawled past like a river of metal and glass. In 3 hours, she would walk down the aisle toward a man who saw her as a strategic acquisition. In 3 hours, she would say "I do" to someone who had never bothered to ask who she really was. But something had shifted in her chest, something sharp and decisive. This wasn't just about testing Richard anymore. This was about teaching him, and perhaps herself, what happened when you mistook manipulation for love. James, I want you to set up a meeting with the board of Meridian Foundation for next month. It's time to go public with my philanthropic work. She turned back to face them, and both James and Catherine stepped back slightly at the transformation in her expression. Gone was the uncertain bride. In her place stood Victoria Ashworth, heir to a pharmaceutical empire, a woman who had built her own fortune on top of the one she'd inherited, someone who had learned to navigate boardrooms full of men who underestimated her. And James? Make sure Richard gets an invitation to the announcement gala. I think it's time my husband learned exactly who he married. The door opened and Madison peered in, her face bright with excitement. Victoria, it's time. The car is here, and Richard is already at the church. Are you ready? Victoria looked at her reflection one final time, seeing not a victim walking toward her doom, but a woman about to embark on the most complex chess game of her life. I'm ready, she said, and for the first time in weeks, she meant it. As they left the plaza and climbed into the waiting car, Victoria felt something settle in her chest, not the fluttering of bridal nerves, but the steady confidence of someone who had just realized they held all the cards in a game their opponent didn't even know they were playing. The church bells were ringing as their car pulled up to St. Patrick's Cathedral, and Victoria Ashworth prepared to become Mrs. Morrison while keeping the secret that would change everything. The first crack in Victoria's resolve came during the vows. Standing at the altar of St. Patrick's Cathedral, surrounded by 300 guests who represented the careful curation of Richard's social climbing ambitions, Victoria watched her groom recite words that felt like a business contract wrapped in romantic language. Victoria, you came into my life when I needed stability, partnership, and someone who understood the value of building something lasting together. Richard's voice carried across the cathedral with practiced confidence, but Victoria noticed he never once mentioned love. Not once. She glanced toward the congregation and caught sight of her mother's worried expression, James's barely concealed disapproval, and Madison frantically taking notes, probably preparing for damage control she suspected would be necessary. When it came time for her own vows, Victoria felt the weight of 200 years of Ashworth legacy pressing down on her shoulders. Her great-great-grandmother had built their pharmaceutical empire from a single patent. Her grandmother had expanded it globally while raising 4 children as a single mother. Her mother had modernized their approach to philanthropy and social responsibility. And here she stood, about to pledge her life to a man who had investigated her like a stock acquisition. Richard, she began, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest, you've shown me exactly who you are, and I accept that completely. A murmur went through the congregation, probably because the words sounded more like a resignation than a romantic declaration. I promise to be equally honest about who I am, in my own time. Richard's smile faltered slightly, but he squeezed her hands as if to anchor them both to the script they were supposed to be following. By the power vested in me by the state of New York. The words blurred together until she heard the final, inevitable conclusion, you may kiss the bride. Richard's kiss was confident, possessive, performed for the crowd. Victoria felt nothing except the cold certainty that she had just legally bound herself to a stranger. Do you think Victoria made the right choice going through with the wedding? What would you have done in her situation? Share your thoughts below. The reception at the Rainbow Room should have been a fairy tale. Instead, it felt like watching someone else's life unfold in slow motion. Victoria moved through the evening like an actress playing a role she'd never auditioned for. She smiled for photographs, accepted congratulations from guests who knew Richard but barely knew her, and watched her new husband work the room like a politician running for office. Mrs. Morrison. The voice belonged to Eleanor Whitfield, Richard's business partner's wife, a woman who collected gossip like rare art. You must be so excited to finally be part of the Morrison legacy. Richard tells us you're from such a humble background. How refreshing. The condescension dripped like honey from a broken jar. Victoria felt her spine straighten instinctively, the same way it did when she faced hostile board members or dismissive investors. Humble is relative, I suppose, Victoria replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Oh, of course. Richard mentioned you work in education. Eleanor's tone suggested this was slightly distasteful, like admitting to a rash. I do some consulting work. The lie rolled off her tongue easily now. She'd been practicing variations of it for 2 years. How lovely that you'll be able to focus on supporting Richard's career now. I imagine the demands of being a Morrison wife will keep you quite busy. Before Victoria could respond, she felt Richard's hand on her lower back, steering her away from the conversation. Come on, darling. There are some people I want you to meet. But as he guided her across the room, she heard Eleanor Stage whisper to another guest, poor thing doesn't realize what she's gotten herself into. Richard will need someone who can keep up with the social demands. I give it 2 years. The words shouldn't have stung. Eleanor Whitfield was exactly the kind of person Victoria had learned to dismiss in boardrooms, but combined with everything else, they felt like salt in an open wound. Richard, she said quietly as he led her toward another group of his associates, can we step outside for a moment? I need some air. We can't disappear now, Vicky. These are important connections for my business. Our business, she noticed he didn't say. My business. Always my. Just 5 minutes. After I introduce you to the Hendersons. They're considering a major investment, and Frank Henderson went to prep school with my father. Victoria felt something snap inside her chest like a guitar string wound too tight. And what exactly does Frank Henderson need to know about your wife to decide whether to invest in your firm? Richard's smile became strained. He needs to know that I have good judgment in all areas of my life. That includes my choice of partner. Partner. The word came out sharper than she intended. Is that what I am? Of course. What else would you be? For a moment, Victoria couldn't speak. She looked around the glittering room, at the ice sculptures shaped like swans, the champagne fountain, the orchestra playing Sinatra, and realized she was living inside someone else's dream. This wasn't her wedding. This was Richard's coronation, and she was just the crown. I need to freshen up, she managed. Introduce yourself to the Hendersons without me. Victoria. But she was already moving, weaving through the crowd toward the ladies' room, desperate for a moment alone to breathe. She locked herself in the marble-appointed powder room and stared at her reflection. The woman looking back at her wore a designer gown and perfect makeup, but her eyes held the hollow look of someone who had just realized they'd made a terrible mistake. Her phone buzzed with a text from Madison. Emergency board meeting moved to tomorrow. The Koreans want to accelerate the merger timeline. Should I reschedule? Victoria stared at the message, feeling the weight of her real life pressing against the facade she'd constructed. Tomorrow, she would need to make decisions that would affect thousands of employees and millions of dollars in pharmaceutical research. Tonight, she was playing the role of Richard Morrison's grateful wife. The disconnect was making her dizzy. Another text, this one from James. Prenup is filed with the court. Congratulations. You're now legally married to a man who has no idea he just signed away any claim to $100 million. Hope you know what you're doing. A laugh escaped her throat, high and brittle. She did know what she was doing. She was conducting the most expensive psychology experiment in history. When she returned to the reception, Richard was deep in conversation with the Hendersons, gesturing animatedly while Eleanor Whitfield hung on every word. He didn't notice Victoria's return until she was standing directly beside him. Ah, there she is. Frank, Helen, I'd like you to meet my wife, Victoria. Frank Henderson looked her up and down with the assessing gaze of someone evaluating livestock. Pleasure to meet you, my dear. Richard's told us so much about your background. Has he? Victoria's voice carried a dangerous edge that Richard was too distracted to notice. Yes, we think it's admirable how he's willing to marry outside his usual social circle. Shows character. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Victoria felt Richard's hand tighten on her arm, whether in warning or support, she couldn't tell. Outside his social circle, she repeated slowly. Well, yes, dear. We all know the Morrison family standards. Very exclusive. But love conquers all, doesn't it? Victoria looked at Richard, waiting for him to defend her, to correct Frank's assumptions, to show even a flicker of the man she'd hoped he might be underneath all the calculation. Instead, Richard smiled and said, Victoria keeps me grounded. She reminds me what's really important. Not who she was. What she was useful for. In that moment, Victoria Ashworth Morrison made a decision that would change the trajectory of both their lives. She was done resisting the truth about her marriage. It was time to embrace it. The honeymoon suite at the Four Seasons felt like a beautifully appointed prison cell. Victoria sat on the edge of the marble bathtub, still wearing her reception dress, watching Richard through the open bathroom door as he paced their suite while barking orders into his phone. Even on their wedding night, Morrison and associates demanded his attention. No, Jeremy, the Henderson meeting is crucial. Move the Tokyo call to accommodate them. What do you mean the projection models don't match? I specifically said to use the conservative estimates. She closed her eyes and tried to remember the last time she'd felt this hollow. Maybe when her grandmother died, leaving her the responsibility of the entire Ashworth legacy at 26. But even then, grief had felt purposeful. This emptiness was different. It was the absence of something she'd never actually had. Sorry about that. Richard finally hung up and loosened his tie, flashing that practiced smile she was beginning to recognize as his default expression. You know how it is. Business doesn't stop for weddings. Does it stop for marriages? The question slipped out before she could catch it. Richard paused in unbuttoning his shirt. What do you mean? I mean, when does Victoria time begin? When do I stop competing with your phone for your attention? His laugh was indulgent, the sound men make when they think women are being adorably irrational. Come on, Vicky. You knew what you were getting into. I told you from the beginning that my career comes first. That's how I've built everything I have. Everything I have. Not everything we have. The possessive pronouns in Richard's vocabulary apparently didn't include his wife. Right, she said quietly. How silly of me to expect my husband to prioritize his wife on their wedding night. Don't be dramatic. We have the rest of our lives together. Victoria looked at him, really looked at him, standing there in his unbuttoned shirt and expensive slacks, checking his phone again while talking about their future like it was a quarterly earnings report. Richard, do you love me? The question hung in the air like incense, heavy and unavoidable. Richard's fingers stilled on his phone screen. Of course I love you. I married you, didn't I? That's not an answer. Victoria, I'm being what? A wife who wants to know if her husband married her for love or for strategy. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan glittered below them, thousands of lights representing thousands of lives, most of them probably more honest than the one she was currently living. Richard set his phone on the nightstand with deliberate care. I think the stress of the wedding is making you emotional. Maybe we should get some sleep. You're right, Victoria said, standing up. I am emotional. I'm emotional because I just realized I married a man who can't tell me he loves me without qualifying it with a business decision. That's not fair. Isn't it? Name one thing you love about me that isn't related to what I can do for your image or your career. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it. The pause lasted long enough to answer her question. Victoria felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, like tectonic plates settling into a new configuration. The girl who had spent 2 years hoping to be proven wrong about Richard Morrison finally accepted that her instincts had been correct all along. I'm going to sleep in the sitting room tonight, she said calmly. Victoria, don't be ridiculous. It's our wedding night. Yes, it is. And I refuse to spend it lying next to someone who married me for reasons he can't even articulate. She gathered her overnight bag and headed for the suite's living area, leaving Richard standing alone in the bedroom, his phone already buzzing with another call he'd probably answer. What do you think of Victoria's decision to sleep separately on her wedding night? Is she being too harsh, or standing up for herself? Let us know your thoughts. The next morning brought their first test of married life, the apartment hunt. Victoria had agreed to move into Richard's penthouse in Tribeca, but a burst pipe had flooded the entire building the week before their wedding. Insurance would cover the repairs, but they'd need temporary housing for at least 2 months. It has to be the right address, Richard insisted as their realtor, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Vance, led them through their third property of the day. Something that reflects our social position. They were standing in a 2-bedroom apartment on the Upper East Side that rented for $8,000 a month, more than Victoria's pretend annual salary, a fact that Richard seemed to find amusing rather than problematic. Don't worry about the rent, darling, he said, patting her arm condescendingly. "I'll handle all the financial decisions now that we're married." Patricia raised an eyebrow. "Actually, Mr. Morrison, given the rental market in Manhattan, most landlords prefer to see both spouses on the application. Mrs. Morrison, do you have employment verification we can include?" Victoria felt the familiar tightness in her chest. "I do consulting work. Irregular income." "I see." Patricia's tone suggested she'd seen this scenario before. Wealthy men with wives who worked just enough to maintain the illusion of independence. "Well, Mr. Morrison's income should be sufficient, but if you have any assets that might strengthen the application." "She doesn't," Richard answered before Victoria could speak. The prenup made that very clear. The casual dismissal in his voice made Victoria's hands clench into fists. She thought about the property she owned 6 blocks away, a 4-bedroom penthouse with a private terrace that she'd purchased in cash 3 years ago. She could have them living in luxury by afternoon if she made one phone call. Instead, she smiled tightly and said nothing. "Of course," Patricia continued, "there are some lovely places in slightly less prestigious neighborhoods. Perhaps Brooklyn Heights." "Absolutely not." Richard's response was immediate and firm. "We need Manhattan. Upper East Side or Midtown at minimum." Victoria watched him pace the apartment's living room, gesturing as he explained his requirements to Patricia: proximity to his office, the right building amenities, appropriate neighbors for networking opportunities. He spoke about their life together like a corporate relocation package. "What do you think, Mrs. Morrison?" Patricia asked, probably sensing the tension. "Any preferences for your new home?" Victoria looked around the sterile apartment with its generic furnishings and standard-issue fixtures. "I think," she said carefully, "that a home should feel like a place where both people want to be." "Naturally. And what would make you want to be here?" The question was innocent enough, but it opened a floodgate Victoria hadn't expected. "Honesty," she said, surprising herself with the word. "I'd want to live somewhere I could be honest." Richard stopped pacing. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I'm tired of pretending that a marriage based on financial calculations is normal. I'm tired of being treated like a line item in your life plan." "Victoria." "No, let me finish." The words were coming faster now, 2 years of suppressed frustration breaking free. "I want to live somewhere I don't have to apologize for existing. Somewhere my husband asks my opinion because he values my thoughts, not because it's socially expected." Patricia looked between them with the expression of someone who'd stumbled into a domestic dispute and was calculating how quickly she could escape. "Perhaps we should take a break and discuss this privately," she suggested. "No," Victoria said, feeling reckless. "I think we should discuss this right here. Richard, tell Patricia why you married me." "This is ridiculous." "Humor me. Explain to this nice woman why Victoria Morrison is the perfect wife for Richard Morrison." Richard's jaw tightened. "You're being irrational." "I'm being direct. There's a difference." The silence stretched uncomfortably until Patricia cleared her throat. "I'll just wait in the car while you two sort this out." After she left, Richard turned on Victoria with barely contained anger. "What the hell was that about?" "That was about the fact that we've been married for 18 hours, and you still can't tell a stranger one reason why you love me." "I don't have to justify my feelings to anyone." "You don't have to justify them. You just have to have them." They stared at each other across the empty apartment, two people who had legally bound their lives together while remaining complete strangers. "Fine," Richard said finally. "You want honesty? Here's honesty. I married you because you fit into my life plan. You're beautiful, educated, and you don't make unreasonable demands on my time or attention. You understand that my career comes first, and you don't compete with it. That's exactly what I need in a wife." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow, but also brought a strange sense of relief. Finally, the truth. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for being honest." "Good. Now can we please focus on finding an apartment?" "Of course. But Richard." "What?" "When we do find a place, I want separate bedrooms." "What? Why?" Victoria gathered her purse and headed for the door. "Because," she said without looking back, "I refuse to share a bed with someone who just described me like a job qualification." As she walked toward the elevator, she heard Richard calling after her, but she didn't turn around. For the first time since agreeing to marry him, Victoria Ashworth Morrison felt like she could breathe. The proximity of marriage was forcing truths neither of them had been prepared to face. And they were only getting started. The marriage counselor's office smelled like lavender and broken dreams. Dr. Sarah Chen sat across from Victoria and Richard in her Upper West Side practice, her expression neutral as she absorbed the tension radiating between the newlyweds who'd been married for exactly 2 weeks and were already discussing separate bedrooms. "Let's start with something simple," Dr. Chen said, her voice professionally warm. "Richard, can you tell me about a moment when you felt truly seen by Victoria?" Richard shifted in his chair, his discomfort palpable. "I'm not sure I understand the question." "A time when you felt like she understood who you really are, beneath the roles you play in the world." The silence stretched long enough for Victoria to study the diplomas on Dr. Chen's wall, the carefully chosen artwork, the tissues strategically placed within reach of the patient chairs. Everything designed to facilitate emotional breakthroughs that felt increasingly unlikely. "I suppose," Richard finally said, when she agreed to sign the prenup without making a fuss. "It showed she understood that I needed to protect what I'd built." Dr. Chen's pen moved across her notepad. "And Victoria, the same question for you." Victoria looked at Richard, this man she'd married who sat as rigidly as if he were in a board meeting. "I don't think Richard has ever let me see who he really is." "That's not true." "Isn't it? Tell me one thing about your childhood that shaped who you became. Tell me about a failure that taught you something important. Tell me about the last time you cried." "This is exactly the kind of emotional manipulation I was trying to avoid," Richard muttered. "Emotional manipulation." Dr. Chen leaned forward. "Can you explain what you mean by that?" Richard's composure cracked slightly. "Women use emotional intimacy as a weapon. They get you to open up, make yourself vulnerable, and then they use that information against you when they want something. Has that been your experience?" The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. Victoria found herself holding her breath, suddenly realizing she might be about to learn something real about the man she'd married. "My mother," Richard said finally, his voice tight with old anger, "was a master at emotional blackmail. She'd cry about how lonely she was, how my father didn't appreciate her, how hard it was being married to such a driven man. She'd make me her confidant, tell me things no child should hear about their parents' marriage." Victoria felt something shift in her chest, not sympathy exactly, but recognition of familiar pain. She'd say things like, "You're the only one who really understands me. Richard, promise me you'll never treat your wife the way your father treats me." But then she'd use those moments of closeness to manipulate me into taking sides, lying for her, keeping her secrets. Dr. Chen nodded encouragingly. "How did that affect your relationships as an adult?" "It taught me that emotional intimacy is transactional. People share their feelings because they want something in return. So I decided to be honest about what I wanted from the beginning. A partnership based on mutual benefit rather than emotional dependency." Victoria stared at him, seeing her husband clearly for perhaps the first time. "So you married me because you thought I wouldn't try to emotionally manipulate you?" "Partly, yes. And you never considered that maybe I was just hoping you'd actually want to know who I am?" Richard's laugh was bitter. "Every woman says that, Victoria. But what you really mean is that you want me to need you emotionally so you can control me." "That's not," she stopped herself, realizing the irony. She'd been controlling him, just not in the way he imagined. She'd been controlling the entire foundation of their relationship by hiding her true identity. Have you ever held back parts of yourself in a relationship because you were afraid of how someone would react? What made you finally open up? Share your story below. Dr. Chen turned to Victoria. "What about you? Can you share something about your background that influences how you approach relationships?" Victoria felt her throat tighten. The carefully constructed lies she'd built around her identity suddenly felt unbearably heavy. "I've never been in a relationship where someone loved me for who I actually am," she said quietly. "What do you mean?" "I mean I've spent my entire adult life watching people's behavior change the moment they learn about my family's wealth. Friends become sycophants. Dating becomes a strategic exercise. Everyone wants something." Richard frowned. "But your family isn't wealthy. You told me your father was a teacher and your mother worked in non-profit management." The lie sat between them like a loaded bomb. Victoria looked at Dr. Chen, then at Richard, then down at her hands. "That's not true," she whispered. "What?" Victoria took a deep breath, feeling like she was about to jump off a cliff. My father died when I was 8. He was actually a pharmaceutical researcher who developed 3 major patents before he passed away. My mother is Catherine Ashworth, chairman of the board of Ashworth Pharmaceuticals. And I inherited controlling interest in a company worth approximately $200 million when I turned 25. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and then something that looked like rage. What did you just say? I lied about who I am. I've been lying since the day we met. Richard stood up so abruptly his chair nearly toppled. You're telling me you've been pretending to be poor while you're actually rich? I'm telling you I wanted to find someone who could love me without knowing about the money. This is insane. You let me pay for everything. You let me feel sorry for your financial situation. You signed a prenup protecting assets you don't have while hiding assets worth hundreds of millions. Dr. Chen held up a hand. Let's take a breath here. No. Richard's voice cracked like a whip. She's been running some kind of con game on me for 2 years. What kind of person does that? Victoria felt tears burning behind her eyes, but her voice remained steady. The kind of person who's been hurt by every single man who found out about her money and suddenly became a different person. The kind of person who wanted to be loved for her mind, her heart, her sense of humor, anything except her bank account. So you decided to lie to me instead. I decided to test you. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Richard stared at her as if she'd grown a second head. Test me. I wanted to know if you could love someone you thought was financially beneath you. I wanted to know if you'd be kind to a woman who couldn't advance your career or enhance your social status. Victoria stood to face him, her composure finally cracking. And you failed, Richard. You failed spectacularly. I failed? You've been lying to me for 2 years. And you've been trying to manage me like a business acquisition. Do you know what you said when Eleanor Whitfield asked about my background? You said I keep you grounded and remind you what's really important. Not who I am, what I'm useful for. Dr. Chen attempted intervention again. Perhaps we should. She's right. The admission came out of Richard like a confession. That's exactly how I think about marriage. About relationships in general. He sank back into his chair, looking suddenly exhausted. My parents had the most emotionally destructive marriage I've ever witnessed. They spent 30 years manipulating each other, using love as a weapon, turning every conversation into a power struggle. Victoria remained standing, her heart pounding, but she found herself listening rather than attacking. When my father died, my mother told me she'd never actually loved him. She'd married him for security and spent 3 decades resenting him for not being the man she'd really wanted. She said emotional love was a luxury poor people couldn't afford, and that smart people married for practical reasons. So you decided to do the same thing. I decided to be honest about it. I told you from the beginning that I valued partnership over passion, stability over romance. I thought you understood what you were signing up for. I thought I was signing up for a chance to change your mind. They stared at each other across Dr. Chen's office, 2 people who had constructed elaborate facades to protect themselves from the very thing they both desperately wanted, to be truly known and loved. The irony, Victoria said softly, is that we both got exactly what we thought we wanted. You married someone who wouldn't make emotional demands on you. I married someone who loved me without knowing about my money. And we're both miserable. Dr. Chen leaned forward. What do you think would have happened if you'd been honest with each other from the beginning? Victoria and Richard looked at each other, the question hanging between them like a bridge neither was sure they were brave enough to cross. I think, Victoria said slowly, I would have spent 2 years wondering if you loved me or my bank account. And I think, Richard admitted, I would have spent 2 years trying to prove I wasn't like every other man you'd met. Would you have been? Richard was quiet for a long moment. I don't know, he said finally. I honestly don't know. It was the most honest thing either of them had said since their wedding day. And somehow, that small admission felt like the first real moment of their marriage. The coffee shop on 82nd and Lexington wasn't the kind of place Richard Morrison would normally frequent. It had mismatched chairs, local art on the walls, and a barista with purple hair who called everyone love in a way that suggested she actually meant it. Victoria had suggested meeting there instead of at their sterile temporary apartment, claiming she needed neutral ground for what she was about to propose. Richard sat across from her, studying her face as if seeing her for the first time. Which, in many ways, he was. So, he said, wrapping his hands around a mug of coffee that cost a third of what he usually paid at his corporate coffee chain, how does this work? Do I call you Victoria Ashworth now? Victoria Ashworth Morrison? Or have you been using a completely different name this whole time? There was still anger in his voice, but underneath it, Victoria detected something that might have been curiosity. Legally, I've been Victoria Ashworth this entire time. The Morrison name was just aspirational, I suppose. Jesus. Richard shook his head. Do you have any idea how this makes me look? My business partners, my clients, they all think I married this sweet, financially dependent woman who needed my protection. And now you're worried they'll think you married me for my money instead of the other way around. The accuracy of her observation made him wince. That's not. Richard, it's okay. I understand the position I've put you in. Victoria leaned forward, her voice gentle. I have a proposal. Another one? Because your last proposal involved 2 years of elaborate deception. Despite everything, Victoria smiled. This one involves the opposite, actually. Complete honesty. I'm listening. I want to start over. Not legally. We're stuck with each other for better or worse at this point. But emotionally. I want us to spend the next month getting to know each other as if we'd just met. Richard raised an eyebrow. Like dating. Like dating. No expectations. No assumptions based on what we think we know about each other. Just 2 people figuring out if they actually like each other. And if we discover we don't. Victoria's smile faltered slightly. Then at least we'll know we gave honesty a chance before we decide what to do about this marriage. Richard stared into his coffee for a long moment. When he looked up, his expression was unreadable. Okay, he said finally. But I have conditions. Name them. First, no more lies. About anything. I don't care how small or embarrassing or complicated the truth is, no more deception. Agreed. Second, we split everything 50-50 for the next month. Dinners, groceries, rent on whatever apartment we choose. I don't want your money influencing how we interact. Victoria nodded, though she suspected Richard had no idea how much money 50% of her expenses actually represented. And third, Richard continued, his voice softer now, if we're really starting over, then I want to start over completely. New apartment, new routines, new everything. I don't want to be the Richard Morrison you think you know any more than you want to be the Victoria I thought I married. What do you think of their decision to start over? Is it possible to rebuild trust after such fundamental deception, or are they just delaying the inevitable? Share your thoughts. 3 days later, they stood in the living room of a furnished apartment in Greenwich Village that was nothing like either of them would have chosen under normal circumstances. It was cozy rather than impressive, quirky rather than sophisticated, the kind of place that prioritized character over status. The kitchen is tiny, Richard observed, opening and closing cabinet doors that clearly hadn't been updated since the 1990s. But it gets incredible light, Victoria countered, looking out the windows that faced a small courtyard where someone had created an impromptu garden with potted plants and string lights. The rent is reasonable. For the village, yes. It's nothing like my penthouse. It's nothing like any of my properties either. They looked at each other and started laughing, the first genuine laughter they'd shared since their wedding day. This is insane, Richard said, but he was still smiling. I feel like I'm playing house. Maybe that's exactly what we need. A chance to play at being normal people instead of whatever we thought we were supposed to be. That evening, they attempted to cook dinner together, a disaster that involved smoke detectors, burned garlic, and Victoria discovering that Richard had apparently never chopped an onion in his life. How have you survived 34 years without learning basic cooking skills? She asked, watching him hold a knife like it might bite him. Takeout, restaurants, and a housekeeper who occasionally took pity on me. He managed to produce one roughly chopped piece of onion and looked ridiculously proud of himself. What about you? Did the Ashworth fortune come with a personal chef? Actually, yes. But my grandmother insisted I learn to cook anyway. She said self-sufficiency was more valuable than servants. Victoria rescued the onion from Richard's incompetent hands. She used to say that anyone who couldn't feed themselves was just a pet with better vocabulary. Your grandmother sounds terrifying. She was. She was also the most formidable woman I've ever known. She built our pharmaceutical company from a single patent she developed in her basement laboratory. Richard paused in his attempt to open a wine bottle. She was a scientist. Biochemist. She revolutionized pain management protocols in the 1960s, then used the profits to fund research into rare diseases that Big Pharma ignored because they weren't profitable enough. And that's the company you inherited. That's the company I've been running for the past 5 years, yes. Richard set down the wine opener and really looked at her. You run a pharmaceutical company. I do. You make decisions that affect people's health, their lives. Every day. And you let me explain venture capital to you like you were a child who'd never heard of investment portfolios. Victoria's cheeks flushed pink. That was awkward, yes. Jesus, Victoria. You must have thought I was the most condescending asshole alive. Not the most condescending, she said diplomatically. Richard sank into one of the apartment's mismatched chairs. I lectured you about fiscal responsibility. I explained compound interest to someone who probably understands financial markets better than I do. To be fair, you couldn't have known. That's not the point. Richard's voice rose, then fell as he struggled with something. The point is that I never asked. In 2 years of knowing you, I never once asked what you actually did for work beyond your vague mentions of consulting. I never asked about your goals, your ambitions, what you cared about professionally. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. Why didn't you ask? Victoria's voice was barely audible. Richard was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with something that might have been shame. Because I didn't want to know if you were smarter than me, or more successful, or more driven. He looked up at her, his expression raw. Because my father spent my entire childhood competing with my mother's intelligence, and it made him cruel. I thought if I married someone I perceived as less accomplished, I could avoid that dynamic. And instead you married someone more accomplished than you can even comprehend, who was pretending to be exactly what you thought you wanted. The irony is not lost on me. Victoria moved to sit on the couch across from him. Richard, can I tell you something? Please. Watching you explain investment strategies to me wasn't condescending. It was endearing. Richard's head snapped up. What? You were so excited to share something you were passionate about. Your whole face changed when you talked about market trends and portfolio diversification. It was the only time I saw you completely unself-conscious. Victoria smiled at the memory. I'd never had someone want to teach me something just because they loved it, not because they wanted something from me. But you already knew all of it. I knew the mechanics, yes. But I'd never seen someone find such joy in explaining how markets work to someone they thought was hearing it for the first time. She paused. It made me hope that maybe you could find that same joy in other kinds of sharing. Richard stared at her. You're saying my mansplaining was charming. I'm saying your enthusiasm was charming. The assumption that I needed explanation was problematic, but the desire to share something you cared about was sweet. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of 2 years of misunderstanding settling between them like dust motes in evening light. Victoria. Yes. I think I'd like to know who you actually are. Not the version you thought I wanted, not the version I assumed you were. The real person. Victoria felt something flutter in her chest, not the desperate hope she'd carried for 2 years, but something quieter and more precious. The possibility of being truly seen. I'd like that too, she said. But Richard. Yeah. I want to know who you are when you're not trying to manage me like a business asset. Richard's smile was rueful but genuine. I'm not sure I remember who that person is. Then I guess we'll figure it out together. Outside their small window, the village was settling into evening rhythms, couples walking dogs, students carrying coffee and textbooks, someone practicing violin in a nearby apartment. It was ordinary life, the kind of life neither of them had ever imagined living. But for the first time since their wedding, it felt like home. The phone call came at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, shattering the fragile peace Victoria and Richard had built over 3 weeks of careful honesty. Victoria jolted awake in the small bedroom of their village apartment, immediately alert in the way that comes from years of emergency board meetings and crisis management. But when she saw James Hartford's name on her phone screen, her blood turned to ice water. James? What's wrong? Richard stirred beside her, squinting at the blue glow of her phone. Over the past weeks, they'd tentatively begun sharing a bed again, not as lovers, but as two people learning to trust each other enough to be vulnerable in sleep. Victoria, I'm sorry to wake you, but we have a situation. Someone leaked your identity to the Financial Times. The story goes live in 4 hours. The words hit her like a physical blow. Victoria sat up so quickly the room spun. What story? The pharmaceutical heiress who fooled Wall Street, Victoria Ashworth's 2-year marriage deception. They have everything, Victoria. Photos of you at board meetings, records of your real estate holdings, even quotes from your wedding guests who've put together that Richard Morrison married one of the richest women in America without knowing it. Richard was fully awake now, sitting up and studying Victoria's face with growing alarm. How? Victoria's voice was barely a whisper. We're still investigating, but it looks like someone from Morrison and Associates talked. The article quotes an unnamed source close to Richard who describes the marriage as the most expensive practical joke in Manhattan history. Victoria looked at Richard, whose expression had gone from confusion to something approaching horror as he began to piece together the one-sided conversation. I have to go, Victoria told James. Call an emergency board meeting for this afternoon. We need damage control strategies before the markets open. She hung up and turned to face Richard, who was already reaching for his own phone. It's out, she said simply. Someone leaked the story to the press. What story? But Richard was already scrolling through his messages, his face growing paler with each notification. Jesus Christ. Victoria, I have 37 missed calls. Richard, I need you to listen to me. Listen to you. He threw back the covers and started pacing the small room. Listen to you? The woman who's been making me look like either gold digger or an idiot for 2 years. That's not fair. Fair. Richard's laugh was harsh. You want to talk about fair? I have a text from my business partner asking if I married you for your money. I have a voicemail from my mother congratulating me on finally landing a whale. I have 3 clients asking if Morrison and Associates is now a subsidiary of Ashworth Pharmaceuticals. Victoria felt her own temper flare. And I have a board of directors who are about to question my judgment for marrying someone they'll assume is after my money. Because that's exactly what this looks like. Is it? The question came out sharper than Victoria intended. Is that what this is, Richard? Because for the past 3 weeks, I actually started to believe you might care about me for reasons that had nothing to do with money. Richard stopped pacing. Of course I care about you. But this, he gestured at his phone, which was buzzing incessantly with new messages. This destroys everything I've built. Do you understand that? My reputation, my business relationships, my professional credibility, it's all gone. Because people will think you married me for money. Because people will think I'm either a fortune hunter or an idiot who got played by his wife for 2 years. The words hung between them like a slap. Victoria felt something crack inside her chest, the fragile hope she'd been nurturing crumbling like sugar in rain. So which are you, Richard? A fortune hunter or an idiot? I'm a man whose wife made him look like a fool in front of everyone he knows. Have you ever been in a situation where external pressure threatened to destroy something good you were building? How did you handle it? Share your experience below. Victoria stood up slowly, wrapping her robe around herself like armor. I see. Do you? Do you really? Because from where I'm standing, this looks like the most elaborate con game in history. 2 years of letting me think I was the successful one, the provider, the one with something to offer. Making me feel guilty for asking you to sign a prenup when you were sitting on $100 million fortune. I was protecting both of us. You were protecting yourself. And now that it's all coming out, I'm the one who looks like either a schemer or a mark. Victoria's voice, when she finally spoke, was deadly quiet. Is that really what you're worried about? How you look? My reputation is everything, Victoria. It's how I built my career. It's how I maintain my client relationships. Your reputation. Victoria repeated the words like they tasted bitter. Not our marriage. Not what this means for us. Your reputation. Richard's silence was answer enough. Victoria moved to the closet and began pulling out clothes. Where are you going? Home. To my real home. To deal with the board meeting and the media and the damage control for my company. Victoria, wait. No. She turned to face him, and Richard stepped back at the ice in her expression. You want to know why I tested you, Richard? This is why. Because when the pressure gets real, when the stakes get high, you default to caring about how you look to other people instead of fighting for what we might have together. That's not fair. You just spent 10 minutes yelling about your professional reputation and not 1 second asking how we're going to handle this together as a couple. Richard opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. 3 weeks, Victoria continued, pulling on jeans and a sweater with mechanical precision. We had 3 weeks of being honest with each other, of actually building something real. And the first moment external pressure threatens that, you immediately start calculating how to minimize damage to your image. What did you expect me to do? Fight for us. The words exploded out of her with 2 years' worth of frustrated longing. Ask how we protect what we've been building instead of asking how you protect yourself from me. Victoria grabbed her purse and her phone, heading for the door. Where are you going? To handle this situation like the CEO I actually am. Alone. Which is apparently how I do everything important in my life. Victoria, don't leave like this. She paused at the door, her hand on the knob. You know what the saddest part is, Richard? For 3 weeks, I actually started to believe you might be different. That you might choose me over your precious reputation. That you might fight for us instead of just protecting yourself. I am fighting. No. You're managing. You're calculating. You're doing exactly what you've always done, treating our relationship like a business problem to be solved instead of something worth protecting. Victoria opened the door, then looked back at him one final time. When you decide whether you want a marriage or just a reputation, you know where to find me. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like the end of everything. Richard stood alone in their tiny village apartment, surrounded by the remnants of 3 weeks of careful trust building, the mismatched coffee mugs they'd shared each morning, the cookbook they'd bought together, the throw pillow Victoria had impulsively purchased because it made her laugh. His phone buzzed with another message, another demand for explanation, another crack in the professional facade he'd spent his adult life constructing. And for the first time in his life, Richard Morrison realized that his reputation might be the most expensive thing he'd ever protected. Because it had just cost him the first real relationship he'd ever had. Outside, Victoria walked through the village streets toward the subway, her breath visible in the cold morning air. She felt hollowed out, scraped clean of the hope she'd been carrying. She'd tested Richard, and he'd failed. But this time, the failure felt less like vindication and more like grief. The boardroom of Ashworth Pharmaceuticals occupied the entire 42nd floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view that stretched from the Hudson River to Queens. Victoria sat at the head of the mahogany conference table, facing 12 of the most powerful people in the pharmaceutical industry, all of whom had read the morning's Financial Times article. The stock dropped 4% in pre-market trading, announced Robert Chen, the company's CFO. Investors are concerned about leadership stability. Leadership stability, Victoria repeated, her voice carefully neutral. She'd showered, changed into her most authoritative suit, and applied makeup to hide the fact that she'd cried in the taxi. Now she was every inch the pharmaceutical heiress the media was portraying her as. Because I got married. Because you got married under unusual circumstances, said Margaret Whitfield, the only other woman on the board and Eleanor Whitfield's sister-in-law. The optics are challenging, Victoria. It raises questions about judgment, transparency, authenticity. Authenticity. Victoria's laugh was sharp. That's rich, coming from an industry that spends billions on marketing campaigns designed to obscure the truth about pricing and side effects. Victoria, James Hartford spoke up from his position at her right hand, perhaps we should focus on damage control strategies rather than. Rather than what, James? Rather than addressing the fact that this board is more concerned about my personal life than the fact that we've increased R&D funding by 30% and fast-track treatments for 3 rare diseases in the past year alone. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Dr. Patricia Vance, the company's chief medical officer, cleared her throat. The concern isn't your professional competence, Victoria. It's the potential for distraction. Marriage is a significant life change, especially a marriage that's attracting this level of media scrutiny. And if that marriage were to end in divorce? Margaret asked delicately. The prenup situation creates some interesting legal questions about asset protection. Victoria felt something cold settle in her stomach. Are you asking me to choose between my marriage and this company? We're asking you to consider whether recent events have compromised your ability to lead effectively, Robert said. Victoria looked around the table at these people she'd worked with for 5 years, people she trusted with her vision for the company's future. She saw concern, yes, but underneath it, she saw opportunity. A chance to question her authority, to suggest that maybe the young woman who'd inherited this empire wasn't quite as stable as they'd hoped. I see. Victoria stood slowly, her hands flat on the polished wood. Let me make something very clear. My personal life has never interfered with my professional judgment. The decisions I've made for this company have increased shareholder value by 40% and positioned us as the industry leader in orphan drug development. No one is questioning your track record, Margaret began. Yes, you are. You're suggesting that because I fell in love and made some personal mistakes, I'm somehow less capable of running this company. Victoria's voice carried the authority that had been bred into her bones, the same steel that had built the Ashworth Empire. You're suggesting that my value as a leader is somehow diminished by my choices as a woman. The boardroom fell silent. Here's what's going to happen, Victoria continued. We're going to release a statement this afternoon reaffirming the board's confidence in my leadership and emphasizing that Ashworth Pharmaceuticals remains focused on our core mission of developing life-saving treatments. We're going to ignore the gossip and get back to work. And if anyone in this room has concerns about my competence based on tabloid journalism rather than quarterly reports, I invite you to submit your resignation. She gathered her papers and headed for the door. Victoria, Margaret called after her, where are you going? Victoria paused at the threshold. To fight for something that matters more than stock prices or media coverage or the opinions of people who've never risked their hearts for anything. What do you think takes more courage? Protecting your professional reputation or fighting for love? Have you ever had to choose between security and taking an emotional risk? Share your thoughts. Across town, Richard Morrison sat in his office, staring out at a view that suddenly felt as hollow as his chest. His business partner, Jeremy Watson, had spent the morning fielding calls from clients, investors, and media outlets, all wanting to know if Morrison and Associates was now secretly controlled by pharmaceutical money. The Henderson Group wants to schedule a meeting, Jeremy announced, settling into the chair across from Richard's desk. They're concerned about potential conflicts of interest now that your wife is, quote, one of the most powerful people in Big Pharma. Richard didn't respond. He was thinking about Victoria's face when she'd left their apartment that morning, the way her voice had broken when she'd accused him of choosing reputation over their relationship. Richard? Are you listening? She was right, Richard said quietly. What? Victoria. This morning, she said I was more worried about how I looked than fighting for us. She was right. Jeremy frowned. Richard, you're being too hard on yourself. Anyone would be concerned about professional reputation in this situation. No. Richard turned away from the window to face his business partner. Anyone who cared more about their image than their marriage would be concerned about professional reputation. Someone who actually loved his wife would be figuring out how to protect her, not how to protect himself from her. You're talking like this is your fault somehow. Richard was quiet for a long moment. Jeremy, can I ask you something? Of course. In all the years you've known me, have you ever seen me fight for anything that wasn't a business deal? Jeremy looked uncomfortable. I'm not sure I understand the question. I mean fight for something because I believed in it, because I loved it, because it mattered to me personally rather than professionally. The silence stretched between them. Jeremy, when my father died, what did I do? You threw yourself into work. Built the firm into what it is today. When my mother remarried that asshole who treated her badly, what did I do? You said it wasn't your business. When Victoria told me she'd been lying about who she was, what did I do? Jeremy shifted uncomfortably. You focused on the practical implications. I've never fought for anything in my personal life. Have I? I've managed, I've calculated, I've protected myself. But I've never actually fought for another person. Richard stood up and walked to his desk, pulling out his phone. The screen showed 43 missed calls, 67 text messages, and 14 voicemails. All of them about damage control, reputation management, crisis communication. Not one of them asking if he was okay. Not one asking about Victoria. Jeremy, I need you to handle the Henderson meeting. What? Richard, this is crucial. No, it's not. Richard grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair. It's business. And for the first time in my life, I have something more important than business to deal with. Where are you going? Richard paused at the door. To do something I should have done 20 years ago. I'm going to fight for something that matters. The elevator ride to the ground floor felt like the longest 42 seconds of Richard's life. As the floors ticked by, he thought about the morning's argument, about 3 weeks of careful honesty, about 2 years of misunderstanding. He thought about Victoria explaining compound interest to her with such joy because she'd wanted to share something she loved. He thought about her lighting up when she talked about her grandmother's legacy. He thought about the way she'd looked at him when she'd suggested they start over, hope mixed with terror, exactly the way he felt now. By the time he reached the lobby, Richard Morrison had made the first purely emotional decision of his adult life. He was going to fight for his marriage, even if it cost him everything else. The Ashworth Pharmaceuticals building was only 12 blocks away, but Richard ran the entire distance, dodging tourists and food carts and his own 34 years of emotional cowardice. He was going to tell Victoria that she was worth more than his reputation. He was going to choose love over image. For the first time in his life, he was going to choose her. The security guard in the Ashworth Pharmaceuticals lobby looked at Richard Morrison like he was either insane or dangerous, possibly both. Sir, I cannot let you into the building without an appointment, the guard repeated for the third time, his hand hovering near his radio. Ms. Ashworth is in meetings all afternoon. Then call her, Richard said, trying to catch his breath after sprinting 12 blocks. Tell her Richard is here. Tell her it's important. Sir, Ms. Ashworth's assistant was very clear that she's not to be disturbed. Tell her, Richard interrupted, his voice carrying a desperation he'd never allowed himself to feel before, tell her that her husband is here to fight for their marriage. Tell her that I finally understand what she meant about choosing her over my reputation. The security guard's eyebrows rose. You're the husband? From the article. Unfortunately, yes. The one who didn't know she was rich. That's me. The guard studied Richard for a moment, taking in his disheveled appearance, his wrinkled shirt, the fact that one of Manhattan's most successful investment advisors was standing in a corporate lobby looking like he'd lost everything that mattered. Wait here, the guard said, reaching for his phone. Richard paced the marble lobby, his reflection multiplied in the polished surfaces that surrounded him. Everything about the Ashworth building spoke of legacy, permanence, the kind of institutional power that made his boutique investment firm look like a lemonade stand. This was Victoria's world. This was who she really was. Mr. Morrison. The guard hung up his phone. Ms. Ashworth's assistant says she's in the middle of a board meeting. Richard's heart sank. But, the guard continued with something that might have been a smile, she also said to send you up. 42nd floor. Madison will meet you at the elevator. The elevator ride felt like ascending to judgment. When the doors opened, a young woman with kind eyes and a knowing smile extended her hand. Madison Chen, Victoria's assistant. I've heard a lot about you, Mr. Morrison. All bad, I'm sure. Actually, no. Victoria talks about you quite differently than I expected, given everything. Madison led him down a hallway lined with photographs of Ashworth Pharmaceuticals' history, scientists in laboratories, ribbon-cutting ceremonies, press conferences announcing breakthrough treatments. She's really something, isn't she? Richard said, looking at a photo of Victoria accepting an award for innovation in rare disease research. She's the most brilliant person I've ever worked with, Madison replied. And the most stubborn. Fair warning, she's been in full CEO mode all day. Very armor-plated. They stopped outside a set of double doors made of frosted glass. Through them, Richard could see the silhouettes of people around a conference table, Victoria's unmistakable figure at the head. Are you sure about this, Mr. Morrison? Because if you hurt her again, I know at least 12 board members who could make your life very complicated. Richard looked at Madison, this young woman who was so fiercely protective of his wife. I'm not here to hurt her. I'm here to fight for her. Madison studied his face for a moment, then smiled. Good answer. She knocked on the door. Victoria, there's someone here to see you. The boardroom fell silent. Richard could see Victoria's silhouette stiffen. I'm in the middle of a meeting, Madison. I know. But I think you'll want to take this one. Richard stepped forward so his shadow would be visible through the frosted glass. Victoria, it's me. I know you're busy, but I need 5 minutes. Please. The silence stretched so long Richard thought she might refuse. Then the doors opened, and Victoria stood there in a charcoal suit that made her look like she could buy and sell small countries before lunch. Her expression was carefully neutral, but Richard could see the uncertainty in her eyes. Board meeting is adjourned for 15 minutes, she announced without turning around. Richard heard chairs scraping, murmured conversations, the sound of a dozen powerful people filing out of the room. Madison gave him an encouraging nod before pulling the doors closed behind them. And then they were alone. Victoria moved to the windows, putting the length of the conference table between them. You shouldn't have come here, Richard. Yes, I should have. I should have come here 2 years ago. I should have asked to see your world instead of assuming I already understood it. This isn't the time. This is exactly the time. Richard stepped closer, his reflection joining hers in the floor-to-ceiling windows. Victoria, I spent this morning worrying about my reputation, my clients, my business partner. I spent exactly 0 minutes thinking about how you were handling this situation, what you needed from me, how we could face it together. Victoria's shoulders tensed, but she didn't turn around. You were right, Richard continued. I defaulted to protecting myself instead of fighting for us. I treated our marriage like a liability to be managed instead of something worth defending. And now I'm here. In your building, in front of your board, making it very clear to anyone who cares that I choose you over my reputation. Victoria finally turned to face him. Richard, you can't just. I called a press conference for 5 o'clock. That stopped her cold. You what? I'm holding a press conference this afternoon. I'm going to tell every reporter in Manhattan that I married Victoria Ashworth because I fell in love with her intelligence, her kindness, her terrible cooking skills, and her habit of stealing the covers. I'm going to tell them that the luckiest day of my life was when the richest woman in America decided I was worth lying to for 2 years because she wanted to be loved for who she was, not what she had. Victoria stared at him. That will destroy your professional reputation. Probably. Your clients will question your judgment. Some of them, yes. Your business partners might lose confidence in you. Jeremy's already worried I've lost my mind. Victoria moved closer, studying his face. Then why are you doing it? Richard reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Because this morning, after you left, I sat in my office trying to figure out how to minimize damage to my career. And then I realized I was holding this. He handed her the paper. Victoria unfolded it with trembling fingers. It was their prenuptial agreement. Richard. What? Page 3, paragraph 7. Read it. Victoria's eyes scanned the document until she found the relevant passage. In the event of divorce, each party retains sole ownership of assets held prior to marriage. Which means the prenup I forced you to sign actually protects your $100 million fortune from me, not the other way around. I know that. That was the point. The point is that you've been protecting me this entire time. You've been ensuring that no matter what happened between us, no one could ever accuse me of marrying you for your money. Because legally, I have no claim to any of it. Victoria looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. So when I hold that press conference this afternoon, Richard continued, and when I tell the world that I love Victoria Ashworth for exactly who she is, everyone will know it's true. Because the woman I married made sure I could never profit from loving her. What do you think makes someone willing to risk everything for love? Have you ever had to choose between playing it safe and taking a leap of faith? Share your story below. Victoria set the prenup down on the conference table with shaking hands. Richard, you don't understand what you're risking. I understand exactly what I'm risking. And for the first time in my life, I understand what's worth risking everything for. He stepped closer. Close enough to see the gold flecks in her brown eyes, close enough to smell the perfume he'd learned to associate with home. Victoria Ashworth, I love you. Not because you're rich, not because you're powerful, not because you can advance my career or enhance my social status. I love you because you care more about orphan diseases than profit margins. I love you because you laugh at your own terrible jokes. I love you because you were brave enough to risk your heart on someone who didn't deserve it, and patient enough to wait for me to figure out that I loved you back. Tears were streaming down Victoria's face now, but she didn't move away. I love you because you made me want to be someone worth loving. And if you'll let me, I want to spend the rest of our lives proving that sometimes people can change, that sometimes love really is enough, and that the best marriages are built on choosing each other every single day. Richard. I'm not finished. He pulled something else from his pocket, a small velvet box that Victoria had never seen before. Victoria Ashworth, will you marry me? We're already married. Will you marry me again? This time for all the right reasons, with all the truth on the table, with both of us knowing exactly who we're choosing. Victoria stared at the ring box, then at Richard's face. You bought me a ring. I bought you a ring that has nothing to do with apologies or guilt or trying to fix what I broke. I bought you a ring because I want everyone who sees it to know that Victoria Ashworth chose me, and I chose her, and we're proud of that choice. Victoria opened the box with trembling fingers. Inside was a simple solitaire diamond, beautiful but not ostentatious, the kind of ring chosen by someone who understood that love didn't need to be expensive to be real. It's perfect, she whispered. Is that a yes? Victoria looked around the boardroom, at the evidence of her family's legacy, at the empire she'd built, at the world she'd been born to rule. Then she looked at Richard, this man who had finally learned to choose love over fear. Ask me again, she said. Richard dropped to one knee in the middle of the Ashworth Pharmaceuticals boardroom, surrounded by 42 floors of pharmaceutical empire, and asked the question that mattered more than stock prices or social standing or anything else he'd ever thought was important. Victoria Ashworth, will you marry me? Will you build a life with me based on honesty and trust and the crazy idea that two people can learn to love each other better than they ever thought possible? Yes, Victoria said, laughing through her tears. Yes, I'll marry you again. I'll marry you as many times as it takes for us to get it right. Richard slipped the ring onto her finger, the finger that already wore the wedding band from their first ceremony, the one that had been based on lies and fear and misunderstanding. This ring was different. This ring was a promise that they were choosing each other with full knowledge of the cost and full appreciation of the gift. When Richard stood up, Victoria threw her arms around him, and for the first time since their wedding day, the kiss they shared felt like the beginning of something rather than the end. I love you too, she whispered against his lips. I love you for being brave enough to change. I love you for choosing us over your reputation. I love you for fighting for our marriage when it would have been easier to walk away. So what happens now? Richard asked, holding her close enough to feel her heartbeat against his chest. Victoria smiled, and for the first time in days, it reached her eyes. Now we go face that press conference together. We tell the world our story, the real story. We let them know that sometimes the best love stories start with terrible decisions and people learning to choose each other anyway. And after that, we go home to our ridiculously small apartment and figure out how to build a marriage based on the radical idea that we actually like each other. I do like you, Victoria Ashworth Morrison. I like you too, Richard Morrison Ashworth. Richard raised an eyebrow. Morrison Ashworth. Well, if we're doing this honestly, shouldn't our names reflect who we really are? A pharmaceutical heiress and an investment advisor who learned that some things are worth more than money. Through the frosted glass doors, they could see the shadows of board members waiting to return to their meeting. Outside the windows, Manhattan stretched in all directions, full of people living their own complicated love stories. But in that moment, surrounded by the evidence of everything Victoria had built and everything Richard had risked, they had something more valuable than either of their individual successes. They had each other. And finally, they had chosen each other for all the right reasons. The love story that had started with deception and fear had become something neither of them had expected. A marriage built on the foundation of two people brave enough to risk everything for the chance to be truly known and truly loved. It was, Victoria thought as she looked at her new ring catching the afternoon light, exactly the kind of love story her grandmother would have approved of.